Welcome everyone to today's talk and workshop. My name is David, and I'll be the MC for today's program, which I think should be a very exciting one. This program is part of the Embracing Oneness project. And today's session on unbiased consciousness, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Sister Denise, who I know many of you know. She's been a student of consciousness, I think, in many ways, all her life, and with the Brahma Kumaris since the 1970s. Many of us remember the 1970s. She was exploring consciousness back then, and is professional training as a journalist. She's an author of many books that are used as textbooks at universities in India on different religious philosophies and practices, and has coordinated a number of Brahma Kumari centers and programs in different parts of the world. So without further ado, happy to welcome Sister Denise for this talk on unbiased consciousness for oneness.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, David. And I'm really happy to be part of the Embracing Oneness project, which is really wonderful. And I think this is what spirituality is all about, going to the core, the essence of what we are as human beings. This idea of being a spiritual being functioning in the material world through a body and interacting with other equally spiritual beings who are genderless, casteless, colorless, religionless, all of these issues that divide us are factors of the costume that we operate through, our bodies. And when we think about ourselves spiritually, then those divisions fade away, fall away. But the thing is, our consciousness is really deeply conditioned from, if you believe in reincarnation, millennia of conditioning that says you are your gender, you are your body color, you are your religion. All of these are your identity. But we're going to look at going past that visible identity that's on all our identification documents to something much more subtle and real. One word that comes to mind when we think about oneness is its opposite. And there is a word that is a little bit old-fashioned in the English language, but it comes originally from India. And it has now become quite politically incorrect, but I think it's a useful one to be aware about. And that word is pariah. So pariah is a word from Hindi language, which means other. So there's us and there's them. And this is really what takes us away from oneness. There are a lot of different philosophies and angles on oneness in the world today, because it's a very important subject as we grapple with issues of the patriarchy, which locks us into gender bias. We are dealing with the effects of a religious angle on people, which looks at people according to gender specifically, and then to other things like where you come from and whether you're considered higher or lower on the ladder of who's okay and who's not okay. And that includes body color, race, culture, class, caste, all of these things which artificially cause an individual to look at another individual as something not completely human, something not acceptable, something less than, something which is a something, when really a person is a someone. And in the practice of Raj Yoga that we do in the Brahma Kumaris, we call all this body consciousness. And the opposite of that is what we call soul consciousness. So, you know, in all of these matters, it's really easy to know everything theoretically, but that doesn't necessarily and automatically mean that we live according to that in a real way, or that our consciousness is in any way changed. So we know the theory, but conditioning, predisposition, prejudice, things that we grow up with that are deeply ingrained within us are things that we don't really see. One thing that I think is very helpful if you want to understand the extent to which you are limited by preconceptions, prejudice, and this idea of someone being other, is when you have the opportunity to live with others of different culture, different background, different race. And I have had a lot of such opportunities. Even I remember one time I was living in a house with about 6 people. They're all different races, all different religions, all different cultures, different languages. There you could really see moments in our interaction where matters of culture and preconceptions got in the way of harmonious communication and free-flowing communication, because it would cause misunderstandings. And the other thing is that these biases act like filters. And we know theoretically about projection, that we project on each other, but knowing it theoretically, of course, as I said before, is not enough. We need to feel it deeply. And this is where we must, I think, through meditation and subtle inner work, spiritual practices, become much more sensitive to our perception, how we use our eyes and ears, and how we look at another human being. So I think the very useful part of soul consciousness that I work with very much is to look past people's behaviors, because people's behaviors is mostly connected with their culture, their preconceptions, their idea of what's right and wrong, which varies from culture to culture. Go past the behaviors and see the essential being. And for that, I think it's really helpful to practice being your own essential self being, and really when you look in the mirror, you see your face, but do you also use what we call the third eye, which is the eye of the mind, the eye of wisdom, the eye of understanding, to look past your face, which shows you your color, your age, your so many aspects of your physical identity, and look past that and see your heart. Because what is your heart? Your heart is not the instrument of your body that pumps blood. That's a different heart. It's very sensitive to your feelings, but your actual heart is where your feelings stem from. Your heart is the core of your soul. And I think most people's hearts are broken, damaged, poisoned. There are many things that happen to a person in life, different kinds of betrayal, different kinds of experiences, especially traumatic experiences when children, that scar a being, that bruise a being, and that distort our perception of others. And so I think the process of reaching unbiased consciousness and seeing what connects us together is a healing process, a healing of the soul, a healing of the heart, the being, because, you know, this idea of reincarnation, I think, comes into it usefully, because when you think about yourself as a spiritual being, that means you're eternal, you're immortal, you're endless, you have always existed, you have been around for millions and millions, eons. And here you are now in the present moment. You don't know about the ancient past. You don't know about the future. But if you think of yourself as an eternal being, then you're implicated and you're impacted by history and by all of the accumulated debt that has come up between people through wars, through the colonial system, through the system of slavery, through religious wars and the spread of religion, through some cultures becoming dominant and dominating or extinguishing, or at least attempting to extinguish other cultures. There's suppression, even within your own culture. The whole question of gender bias is extremely prevalent the world over. The patriarchal system exists in all the conventional religions, in most cultures of the world. Very few parts of the world, probably where there are more ancient cultures, have the aspect of matriarchy, where people are much more independent of gender bias, or they don't see each other's gender. Living in a very mixed culture, as I did for quite some time in California, where so many people of so many races, mixed backgrounds. I think there were 84 languages in the school system. That was a very interesting experience for me, because so many people were naturally moving past the racial differences, the sexual orientation differences, and just really, it was part of the way of life to look at the being within. Of course, there are many people who don't, but there was a lot who do. And so it was very natural, very comfortable for me to live in a world where you were just beyond all of those things. And then when I would enter a part of the world where there are strong biases, strong racism, strong gender bias, it felt quite shocking that that part of the world had not caught up with what I felt was really a good level of personal advancement and cultural advancement. Disability is a big issue, and a lot of people haven't quite overcome their preconceptions about others with disabilities. because you project extra things. You think if somebody has a disability, well, maybe they can't do a job properly. But your physical disability doesn't necessarily imply in a lack of competence in other areas, but some people are very limited by that. If a person has mental health challenges, this is a very difficult one, because I think a lot of people haven't really learned or haven't really understood what is the meaning of interacting with an unbiased consciousness with someone who doesn't function mentally in the same way as you do yourself. Because there are expectations and assumptions that we all have that make us impatient with others who are not coming up to those expectations. But we have to think about it, because I do feel that this is something that hasn't quite got sorted out in the larger community by any means. There are also language issues. You know, one of the most difficult languages is the English language, because it is spoken by so many people in so many parts of the world. And each place where it is spoken, it's spoken differently for a number of reasons. And this is partly because language is a living thing, and it shifts and moves around wherever it is spoken. And because English is spoken in vast areas of the world, it has acquired a sort of hyphenated state. I remember when I first moved to United States, many of the people there were using English in a way that I had never used it, and used words that I had never been acquainted with. And I really saw that, you know, there was like a barrier, a language barrier, even within the English language. The way it is spelled, the way it is written, the way slang has developed in different parts of the world, the way English is used in India and Australia and Africa and United States, Canada, Europe, is practically become like a different language. But yet, English is the language of the internet, it's the language of business, commerce, artificial intelligence, science. It is really an international language. And another thing that happens with that is that English-speaking people are very impatient and maybe insensitive to people who don't speak English. There are so many people for whom English is their second language, but yet there are many, many who do not. And so we need to practice to not impose our language on others, assuming the others are not sufficiently competent because they don't know my language. I think that's an issue that also hasn't necessarily been looked at deeply. I think also when there are different cultures who speak English from their cultural origination, and they all come together, there are many opportunities for misunderstanding, because words are used with very, very different meanings. And this can create a lot of upset between people. People may feel insulted when English is used in a certain way, but you don't know that you're insulting the people. So I think we are dealing with some cases, we're dealing with ignorance, we're dealing with a lack of adequate education in what the issue is. So that's also an important area to think about. There are many different ideas about what oneness is. There are different philosophies. For example, if you are into the idea of mindfulness, which is a more Buddhist type of approach, and there are many Eastern religions which say we are all one, in the sense that we are all one thing. We are all part of a greater thing. And that is one idea of oneness, to try to be conscious of being all part of one greater thing. Then there are other theological, philosophical angles which say, no, everyone is an individual, and we have many things in common. There is the idea of fraternity, that all beings are brothers. It takes you away from gender bias. Of course, brothers doesn't mean male bodies. Brothers means fraternity, that means equality, that means that you have a bond with each other that's natural, of trust, and you are part of the great human family. And trust is a big issue. People don't trust those who are pariah, those who are other. And someone who is your own, you will trust. So one very important attribute of oneness is to get past those aspects of discrimination to do with trust, and really see that all others are your spiritual brothers, and to see the being in front of you, regardless of the fact that they may see you through their filters. And there is an idea that exists in the spiritual practice that I do. And this idea comes with another word from India called drishti. And so drishti is the way you look through your eyes, and what you see when you look through your eyes. Do you see the being, or do you see the shell in which the being, through which the being is operating and interacting, you see? And this spiritual drishti, we call it spiritual drishti, where you are very conscious of seeing yourself as a spiritual being, and you see the other as a spiritual being. Now, as another level of this, which may be a little hard for people to acquire or assume in how they perceive and what their angle of perception is, but there's this idea that people all are actors, they all have roles, they are doing things that are predestined. The culture that most people are in is very moralistic. And when you're in a moralistic culture, you have a very specific idea about what's right and wrong. You have your own values, which you assume to be universal values. And of course, there's no such thing. Everyone's values are their own. And there's a lot of clash of values because people believe in universal values, which is actually completely false. There cannot be anything like universal values, because it's against the meaning of the word values. Values means 1, 2, 3. We cannot say that all numbers have the same value. That's why numbers are there. So having this erroneous idea of universal values actually prevents the harmony that I think is inherent in the idea of unbiased consciousness. So you have to understand your own values. You have to understand that other people's values have their own foundation, and they may not be the same as yours, but that doesn't make them necessarily less valid. There are universally accepted principles, like, for example, the United Nations document of human rights is a very good document because it's very sensitive to the rights and needs of every human being. And someone whose values are opposed to that, well, their values may well be in opposition to different laws which are there to protect people. But I think it's also worthwhile thinking about your values and understanding how you can have an unbiased consciousness while at the same time taking into consideration that the people you're interacting with may have very different values from you, but those values are not without value. They're not necessarily bad by any means. The problem of a moralistic society is looking at people in terms of good people and bad people. And I would rather do it differently. I would rather say, okay, all people are people. All people are spiritual beings who are essentially pure and peaceful, loving, blissful beings of light. And all are spiritually depleted. So when a person is spiritually depleted, they have a tendency to act against their essential nature. And that type of action becomes a negative karma or a negative action or something which steps on the toes of someone else's rights and someone else's value as a human being. So we have to look at that, I think, the whole matter of dealing with a world, the human race, being pretty much universally spiritually depleted. And because of that, people act against their essence. And again, when you come back to the essential self and you compare who you are essentially to what you're doing, then you see where the discrepancy lies. I'll give you an example. I was talking to someone who said, you know, I'm a really fabulous person. I love myself greatly. And I'm just so happy that I am who I am. And I looked at this person and I had seen some of the things that this one had done to other people. And I thought to myself, well, okay, that's great that you love yourself. But if I would abuse other people like you do, I couldn't love myself. So you see, there are so many variables going on. And we assume other people are like ourselves, but in fact, everyone's really very different. Even though we have so much in common, we need to discuss these things. We need to talk about it to find these elements that connect the humanness of each other to each other, so that we can move forward in harmony. So I think, to me, I would probably have to say that my interpretation of oneness is more like harmony with others, and taking into account and giving space for the huge differences there are between us, and not allowing that to be a reason to dislike someone or reject someone or interact with them in an unkind way. So I would like you to maybe consider some of the questions I've raised and bear it in mind.
How do I detect unconscious bias blind spots that I might have? How do you detect those blind spots? Could you say a few words about that?
What I've found in my life experience is that a lot of these things are cultural. So when you are living with people of the same culture, the same social background, the same education, all these similar things, where you find yourself with people who are like yourself, and then everybody has an agreement, a sort of tacit agreement that our values are the best values, and we interact with each other according to them, but actually it hides a lot of bias against people who are different, which only come up when you start interacting with people who come from a different background, they're in a different culture, they have different values, and there's a clash. And it's only really when a clash comes up, or a misunderstanding, you can call it, that you realize that you've been operating on the basis of a very narrow window of perception. And so you have to work it through. So I have found the most valuable thing in my life has been this opportunity to live and work with people of very, very different cultures, religions, all kinds of different nationalities and so on, because again and again and again, it flags up these unconscious biases, and I have to work through them and own them. And I think in that way, I could become much more of a universal citizen or world citizen or something like that, you know?
Lovely. Could you say a little bit more on this difference between a moralistic society and a values-based society? There seems to be a real shift that's needed in the world to heal from the inconsistent judgments we make about differences and how we view differences. And you seem to capture that, talking about a moralistic versus a value-based society. Could you elaborate on that some?
Well, I think I don't look at them as this opposition of value-based and moralistic, because the thing is, when you use the word value-based, which a lot of people use, it presumes that there is such a thing as universal values. And I did a huge piece of work about values maybe 25 years ago. And in the process, I interviewed many people, I surveyed, I did all sorts of things. And my one conclusion was that there is no such thing as universal values. So a value-based society and a moralistic society is the same thing. So therefore, what I would say is it's about identifying words and defining words, because these type of words are used differently by different people with different meanings. And there you get lots of clashes of understanding, and it becomes really difficult. So a moralistic, when I say moralistic, I mean somebody who has this idea about what's right and wrong according to their culture, their religion, where they come from, and they want to impose it on everybody else who may have a different morality. And because morality is basically, in terms of its meaning, it's public opinion. That's morality. And it doesn't have a divine origin by any means. It's public opinion. And so it includes all sorts of biases. Then you say, okay, let's get away from that and we'll say values. And then there's this assumption of universal values gets people to have the idea that their values are the right ones, and anybody else who doesn't have those values doesn't have any values. And there's a lot of people who think like that. So it becomes, again, a trap. And so my conclusion is that one common element is to take these 5 essential, quintessential qualities of the soul of purity, peace, power, love, and bliss, you see. And if you say, okay, this is my essential characteristic, and insofar as I'm spiritually depleted, I'm not able to interact fully according to those qualities, and thereby I will maybe do something hurtful or harmful to somebody. But to strive to be spiritually strong, which is done through meditation, enables you to function as a pure, peaceful, powerful, loveful, blissful being of light, which is not an easy thing to do when you're under duress, provocation, and all sorts of stuff. Your traumas get triggered and so on and so forth. So this is a very complicated thing. It's not an easy thing. But I feel that, for me at least, if I make that my baseline, the essential qualities of the soul, that seems to be better, because you can't impose on other people to be pure, peaceful, powerful, loveful, blissful being of light. You have to be that yourself and see the other person as that. And then whatever their mistakes are, you have to be compassionate and generous. You have to know how to set limits and boundaries. So it's like it's a huge science of living in harmony with others who are different and who are likely to be spiritually depleted, traumatized, many, many things. So your generosity and your compassion and your effort to be real yourself, I think, is
there's some more
good way to
questions here,
go.
but before I look at them, could you say a little bit more about that statement you made about we're all implicated and impacted by history and accumulated debt? That's a very powerful statement. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, this is a very tricky one, because you don't know what you were in your previous incarnation, or the one before that, the one before that, the one before that, whatever. You don't know how much time you've spent on this earth, whether it's just this body or whether it's more than that. So it's very individual. But inside your being is the experience of a huge amount of time. For example, for myself, I'm looking at the identity of myself as an eternal soul who has passed through all of history. I've been, many, many births and so on. This is how I think of myself. I can't say that for everybody else, but for myself, that means I have been through, the medieval times, the prehistoric times. I must have been in many different cultures and religions and so on. So it's like there is somewhere in there the experience of it. And you may, when I go into the depths of the philosophy of karma, okay, here I am, I took birth as an English person. I have a lot of connection with India. So Britain and India have a karmic debt. To what extent am I implicated by that? My relationship with India, my relationship with people of India there, how they perceive me. I remember one time going to a historical place in Delhi where there was a terrible massacre, where the English people had done this to many, many Indians, killed them in a very horrible way. And they were looking at me like, they said to me, okay, you did this. And I thought, well, I don't think I did. I don't have that feeling. I know that I have had many lives in India and other places, but the power of that assumption that if you are an English person, you are personally responsible for what your government did a century ago. But at the same time, there is, to some extent, something that you have to take responsibility for. And it's quite tricky to calculate. And I think one must do it intuitively. But I think this is also where your prejudices and preconceptions and biases come from, because your education is that you learn history according to the bias of the country and the social class where your institution of education comes from. So you are trained to think in a certain way, which may or may not be true, and which is not necessarily unbiased by any means, and which you are conditioned, you are cultured by your ancestry, you see, and you kind of carry that with you. And to make oneself completely free from the past and return to your essence is, for me, my spiritual practice. And it's very individual the way I do it. But because I'm aware of how complicated these things are, it's difficult to make generalizations. But I do think that all of us are impacted by how history follows us, you see, and it creates mentalities and reactions and perceptions and all these things. So difficult to know what comes from actually me and what comes from my environment and what's been fed into me that I've absorbed into myself and taken on board unconsciously, you see, and then I play that out. I'm not free.
But also, when you said how we get conditioned by our education, that also, I think, relates to me in terms of when we hear these terms, these realities that we see in front of us in the world in some ways of patriarchy and sexism and racism and all of these strong biases in the world that have actually been put into, rules and regulations in some ways. We can change our own behavior, but there are structures and systems that have become entrenched in society. How do we work on them? Do we accept them? Do we try to change them? Or should all the focus go on ourselves?
No, these things are institutionalized by the state, and they're part of the religion, they're part of the legal system, they're part of the social system. And if you do anything differently, you are deviant. And you may be behaving in an illegal manner, which is spiritually correct, but legally you can be imprisoned or shot or whatever for being pure. And this is a wonder, but it is very widespread. And I think that to be aware that the state is responsible for institutionalizing culturally held biases, which have been put in place since 1,000 years, 2,000 years, you can't easily do anything about that. And so in my analysis, the only way that you can have really big change is after a major, major war. And I mean, there were very important changes that could be instituted after the Second World War, maybe also after the First World War, because, there were so few people left. and especially in the Second World War, 80 million people were killed, and most of them by starvation. So there's a trauma for the world, and all the people of my parents' generation were traumatized, and they passed that trauma on to their children, and so it goes on. But because of the requirement to rebuild the society, it having been badly damaged, there could be change initiated into the process of the state. But when you're in peacetime, not so easy by any means.
There's a comment here you may want to respond to on this topic. Unfortunately, only the dominators, e.g. the victors in wars, those who colonize others, etc., get to write history. Therefore, history is usually far from the truth. Any response to that?
Well, that's absolutely right. And history is propaganda, the way we learn it. But then if you are assiduous enough to do serious research and you're patient and you find out stuff, then you realize that the storyline that everybody is told is something else. And that's just something that you don't really have that much control over in terms of what the storyline is to everybody else, but at least you can satisfy your own self about things. And I think, to me, an important part of my life is my relationship with people who come from very different backgrounds, who may have, been raised in different cultures and so on. And I listen to them, I talk to them, and I find out what really went on. And I don't know, it's part of my background as an investigative journalist, though I wasn't doing that professionally for very long, but I'm pretty much of an investigator type.
Could fulfillment be about our values, what matters to us, instead of fulfillment being a target and a goal?
Well, I wouldn't think fulfillment is either of those things. I think also it's quite personal what people mean by fulfillment. And for me, fulfillment is for me to become completely true to myself, and for me to fill myself spiritually so that I'm no longer operating on the basis of spiritual depletion. Fulfillment to me is the opposite of emptiness and the opposite of ignorance. And so it's work that you need to do to become true to yourself, I think. I think it also depends on, what your values are. You see, my highest value is freedom, but there are not very many other people who think like that. Most people prefer security, or they want wealth, or they want family, or they want different things. So not everybody's the same. And I can really only properly speak for myself because I know myself. I live with myself. And I'm quite a solitary person. So maybe you would say that's very selfish, but, that's the way a person is the way a person is. And so fulfillment, it varies, but I think that everyone has a right to their own fulfillment as long as it doesn't prevent someone else having their fulfillment. Because it's a matter of boundaries. And if your fulfillment prevents somebody else having their fulfillment, then your fulfillment is doesn't have validity because it's selfish.
When we understand that we're individually at different levels of consciousness and awareness, we all learn and grow at different paces, etc. How do we move ahead this whole vision of oneness? How does it become a reality for all when there's 8 billion people on the planet, all at different levels of consciousness thinking about these things?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I have this idea about the microcosm and macrocosm. And then I also have an idea of a midicosm, a middle somewhere. So the microcosm is an individual, and the macrocosm is all of humanity. And the midicosm is maybe the group that you are working with. So the people that I am particularly working with are the people who practice Raj Yoga, who study meditation with the Brahma Kumaris, and which is a gathering of 1 million people, all of whom are very, very different from each other. I mean, many are very similar to each other, but many are very, very different and very individual. But I think that it's an arena where you can work with, in a visible way, tangible way, what difference does it make to the group when I myself am progressing in an authentic, genuine way? Does it have a beneficial impact? Because, you know, if you impose something on the group, that's tyranny, and that's not really what we're interested in. But if you can be maybe an energy that inspires such things like purity, peace, love, bliss, and inner power, then you're being sustaining without being imposing, and allowing people to absorb whatever they feel like absorbing, if they want to absorb anything or not. You know, you're just doing your little bit, and you don't know whether it's working or not, but you have to have faith that it is a good thing to do and worth doing, because it might have a good effect.